I think we're not live today, is that right? We're recording this?
Oh, no, it's live and recorded, yeah.
Okay, because it's 10 o'clock.
Uh-huh. Are we on? There, Claude?
Yeah, just bring the titles up.
Okay, yeah, we'll get started in a minute.
Let me try to look pretty here for the camera. Used to be easier years ago.
Okay. Well, I guess Kent's not showing up for us, huh?
Gee, do we have anybody know his phone number?
Let's see.
Okay, Nathan.
All right. Good morning and welcome to C.A.B.B Notes for May 2018. And we've been talking about this series of helping those who are most vulnerable. And we talked about people who didn't have any place to live or didn't have any health care or didn't have any food. So today we're talking about the vulnerable people who have problems with drugs. And we're extraordinarily fortunate to have two very important experts in town on this topic. Tom Simic, is it?
Simic?
Simic, yep, from UCS, and Nels Klossner from the Hawthorne Recovery Center, right?
Yeah, yes. Nice to be here, Nate.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. And just for the last few minutes, 20 minutes, we've been discussing this topic, and it's really fascinating to me to know how much these people know about this whole topic. You know, I have all kinds of ramifications that I'm totally not aware of, and I'm sure lots of people have just a very superficial idea about the whole drug problem. So just to start out, why don't we start with you, Tom, and you can just give us your background, your pedigree, and your general involvement in this problem.
Well, I'm a licensed psychologist in Vermont, and I'm also a licensed drug and alcohol counselor. I've been doing this since 1985, so
Wow.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
This really started out with cocaine and crack cocaine epidemic. Sort of became interested in that when somebody I cared about became addicted, and then went on to get additional training. And has been in it ever since. And UCS made a decision some years ago that they would combine both mental health and substance abuse treatment in the same department because we were seeing people increasingly turn to substances as a means of coping. So
Yeah.
I've been doing this for a while.
And Nels?
Yeah, so I'm a board certified psychiatrist, and I also certified in addiction medicine. And I got interested in this because when I was going through sort of medical school and residency, the things that really appealed to me were psychiatry.
Yeah.
And because what you hear your primary care folks often tell you is that about 50 to 80% of their appointments or their visits with patients are around psychiatric, psychological issues. So I thought, well, if that's the case, then why don't I kind of go straight for the source?
Yeah.
And then as I got involved with psychiatry, then I said, well, you really should assume that traumas and some sort of substance are playing a role in the patients that you see. And that could be either as a primary driver of the reason for seeing a psychiatrist, or just could be exacerbating or making things worse, or making the healing process not go as well. So I thought, well, if that's where the money is, let's go there and try to find the source of the suffering there.
Yeah.
And it made sense to me too. I mean, you think about the use of substances, the things that we consider to be drugs. They fit into receptor systems that are in our brains and bodies. And so the idea that we feel good, that we keep on doing this, is part of our evolutionary drives.
Yeah.
But it also just seemed like, wow, this really makes sense then, that alcohol goes to a whole bunch of receptors, nicotine goes to nicotine receptors, opioids go to opioid receptors, even cannabinoids like the marijuana products are cannabinoid receptors. And so I thought, this is the way the body works, and this is things getting offline. And again, what I think what most of us do is eventually find something we really like, that appeals to us and makes sense, and in this case was really intellectually intriguing as well. And so, without looking back, that's what I've been doing since I left my residency training.
Great. It's interesting that the thing about feeling good or feeling high or whatever makes me think of my college cross-country days. The times when I felt the most exhilarated, the most happy, were times we had just run 3.5 miles or whatever it was, and it's called country races.
Yeah, the so-called runner's high,
Yeah.
when the endorphins kick in after a certain amount of aerobic exercise, makes you feel good. I think people have a natural tendency to look for things that make them feel good. And, you know, it can be sport activity, music, art, connecting with certain people, and so on. They find that. But sometimes in people's lives, they come across substances. They get exposed to it, and they find that there is an experience that they have that they like. It's called, you know, just finding the high. And then for some folks, they end up chasing the high. They like that experience so much that they begin to pursue it more regularly. And that's when things start to happen that are potentially difficult. When they're not learning other ways of coping, when they're spending money for these substances to make them feel this the way that they like, something called tolerance kicks in, meaning that they need to have more and more of it in order to get the same effects that they used to get on less. And then a variety of other things can happen as well. Social issues in their lives, legal issues, physiologic issues, withdrawal, a variety of things can happen out of that problematically.
Yeah, and like you said with the endorphins, I mean, that's basically a Latin word for an internally produced opioid.
Oh, really?
Right? Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, you know, for a species to survive, you need to seek things that are pleasurable, right? I mean, for example, you know, pleasure that we get from being in companionship. You know, there's endorphins and another chemical called oxytocin, which is part of that connection and feel good that we get from being with people socially. And you know, we'll hear stories about maybe loggers who a tree falls on them and they kind of drag their half mangled leg into the truck and get to the emergency department, and people are asking, wow, how did that happen? Well, that's a surge of endorphins because they also kill pain. So as well as for pleasure and pain, then we notice when people get these opioid medications, whether you're starting with the opium, heroin, or OxyContin, you know, Percocet, that these are more powerful than the naturally produced endorphins. And so what you happen is sort of you're turbocharging the system we have in our brains. And for a lot of people, that you know, for some people who are fortunate, for example, the constipation that comes with that is intolerable. The alteration in their thinking is unpleasant to them, and they're just like, I don't want that. Give me something else. But if you remember the movie Hungry Heart, that traveled around Vermont, Dr. Holmes up in St. Albans area, and the title Hungry Heart came from what one of the subjects, one of the patients had said, was that when I first tasted the opioids, it's like it filled a hole in my heart. And so then if you have that experience, then you've got deep troubles, my friend.
Yes, I think so.
It's interesting that some of the people that I've spoken with that opiates are their drug of choice, they refer to the Adam and Eve story, the apple, as really an opium poppy.
Oh, really?
And that's, you know, again, this whole concept of filling something that's empty in you, whether it's a receptor site or something that's going wrong in the way that you have relationships or something else that's missing in your life. Once people find this substance and start chasing it, that's when these troubles come on. And the doctor was talking about other things that are related to withdrawal, which is a misery for patients. Many of my clients come in saying, you know, I don't even do this to get high anymore. I just do this to stay normal, so that I'm not going through withdrawal, which has a number of things that go on, the stomach, the nausea that the doctor was speaking of, but also their noses run, their eyes tear, and their joints in their bodies just ache like a son of a gun. Just think of the worst flu that you've ever had, and
really?
That's what it's like. And then taking an opiate takes that away right away, and so they get trapped by this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, most of the time you see somebody who's become addicted to medication, whether it's your alcoholic, your opiate dependent person. Like Tom was saying, that exposure of the outside substance into the receptor system then creates changes in how the receptors work. And so then what happens is when you don't continue to fill that receptor with that substance, you get some sort of withdrawal syndrome. And with all the drugs, I mean, cocaine is a milder one, marijuana, alcohol has a potentially deadly withdrawal cluster of symptoms, and the opioids as well. The withdrawal symptoms for that are really very much like the most awful flu you could imagine. Although patients I work with, then you need to magnify it by a few more.
Yeah.
And then too, this is the piece where I think really opened my eyes to get into this work, is when I realized that they were using these substances to fight off withdrawal. That withdrawal was such an uncomfortable state that we weren't talking about pursuit of pleasure or being lazy. We were talking about really suffering physically and mentally, and that this was the way to relieve that. And if you can imagine, Nathan, we've all had the flu, and basically what our doctors tell us is a lot of fluids, go to bed, take care of yourself, take ibuprofen, Benadryl, what have you, and maybe in 4 or 5 days, a week, you'll feel better. And then can you imagine the way you're feeling in that state if I said, but I've got a magic pill. If you take this, you'll start to feel better in 15 minutes. And what do you think you would do? And that's unfortunately what the opioids do. They act like this magic pill that then gets into the receptor system that's been altered and calms down the withdrawal and calms down the cravings. And people get in this just crazy pursuit of the drugs in order to continue to feel normal. And that's where I jump in with medication and are able to start working with people then, because you can't do anything productive when you're struggling with just trying to chase in order to feel normal.
Yeah.
And so by using medically assisted treatment, the prescription for Suboxone, it quells these withdrawal issues, and it gives people a chance to start to learn how to live their lives in a different way. If they get the opportunity to have some counseling go on, to learn how to deal with their feelings, to deal with the other issues that are going on in their life, whether it's trauma or other pressures and stresses that they have. There are other ways of managing them without necessarily using a pill or a chemical. And that's what the behavioral component is for treatment. And this is what we do at United Counseling Services. We have something similar to what the doctor has at Hawthorne. We have something called IMAT, Intensive Medically Assisted Treatment, where people who have sometimes failed out of earlier attempts at treatment for a variety of reasons can go, where they get daily observed dosing, which is important because of the diversion issues that go on in this. They get intensive case management. They get to see a medical doctor weekly. They also get the counseling. There are groups and individual counseling to help people learn another way. Otherwise, if we're only prescribing, and I don't mean it only because it's a key component. Without it, the research, it shows that maybe 3% of people get better without a year later or 2 years later without using that treatment. But Suboxone costs a lot of money. You want to get some people eventually in good health again and off of even medically assisted treatment, that they've learned how to live their lives without it. Otherwise, Vermont Medicaid is, I think the last time I heard, was spending $15 million a year for Suboxone prescriptions. Starts to add up to real money pretty soon. And there are only so many doctors. Nels is one of the very few who specializes in this. But you're only permitted to have how many patients?
Yeah, well, there's the DA's put limits on how many patients the physician's allowed to prescribe Suboxone to.
Really?
Because they were concerned, again, it's an opioid, and they were concerned about creating more problems. And originally it was 30 patients, and then they allowed doctors who've been prescribing for a year to go up to 100 patients. And then recently last year, I think it was Representative Markey from Massachusetts started to introduce some legislature about how artificial that was to keep the limit at 100 patients. And they decided with a lot of the acts that go on to enhance opioid treatment nationally to increase the limit to 275 patients per qualified physician. Yeah. And I mean, again, and part of it, you know, of course, it's expensive. I mean, everything's expensive. Treatment's expensive.
Yeah.
But when people look at the payback for this, there's a group that does comparative research on various treatments, and in this case, they looked at the treatments with Suboxone and methadone versus no treatment whatsoever. And what they found out was that no treatment is more expensive than the treatments we offer. So we talk about maybe the health department budget or the Medicaid budget around something like this. That's one set of numbers. But then if you start to look at property crime, healthcare costs,
loss of productivity
as well, then you see that costs much more than the money we're spending to actually have people in treatment.
And legal, those people who end up in really bad relationships with substances and they're doing illegal activities in order to afford it or do it. The legal system is awash in substance-involved crime. And the last I heard, that the Department of Corrections in Vermont was one of the biggest expenditures for your and my tax dollar there. So helping people learn to live their lives without these chemicals, you know, is cost savings in this.
And especially on the opioids, I mean, the short answer is that it saves lives. Some of the larger treatment centers, Hazleton, for example, Betty Ford Clinic, they're very much using sort of what we call 12-step approaches, which comes from AA, the 12 steps of recovery. And taking a sort of abstinence-based approach, meaning if you work the steps, if you were part of the fellowship of AA or NA, that then you would be able to stay substance-free. And really starting off with alcoholics, that was a system that worked for a number of people struggling with alcohol. What they found out, however, was that patients who had gone through their treatment centers were overdosing and dying after they left treatment. And so that opened their eyes to, you know what, we might have this. We might have been using this philosophical approach that is based in the approaches that we had with alcoholism, but now with opioids, that's not an approach that's tenable anymore. And they realized that, and I think all treatment centers, it's considered a standard of care. So if you're not offering these sorts of treatments, then you're really behind the times, and are starting to offer the MAT, medication-assisted therapies, Suboxone and methadone, and sometimes naltrexone as well, to their patients as part of their aftercare programs.
And so in addition to AA and NA, and AA, by the way, was started by a Vermonter, Bill Wilson, and there's the famous Wilson House up in Dorset, where people literally come from around the world on pilgrimage to go to a place that has helped them. The 12 steps have been an enormous help. There is no doubt about it in this. And when I have somebody that's willing to commit to the 12 steps, hooray on it. But modern treatment includes a variety of other things. We use values-based treatments now to try to get people to be invested in their own recoveries on this. We use something called motivational interviewing because often people are a little reluctant to start treatment. They're in something called pre-contemplation. Do I want to do this? Maybe let me kick the tires on this for a while.
I don't got a problem. You got a problem. Leave me alone. Right?
Exactly that kind of thing. And so beginning to look at some of the positive benefits from that. And then there are other stages that people go through in the stages of change. There's a model that we use that starts out with pre-contemplation, works its way up through contemplation, preparation, action stages, and then maintenance. And obviously people can slip and go back to an earlier stage, but there's specific things that we can talk with people about to try to keep them encouraged to stay the course in treatment. And then there's a modern form of therapy called ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, that again is based on values and committed action. Mindfulness, we teach people how to meditate, how to calm themselves without using a chemical in this. And that has, we found, has been really beneficial. People have tended to gravitate towards it and to hold on to it even when things are tough. There's a metaphor I use in the substance abuse group that I run based on a movie that I've seen and encourage people to see. It's called The Shallows with Blake Lively, for those interested, where she's trapped in a lagoon on a rock, and there's a shark coming around, and how does she get to shore? How do you get to your goal in this? Do you just give up and let the shark get you as the water rises, or do you use your values and other things to figure out how you're going to survive this? And there are in recovery, there are many sharks out there that are in the way of staying with recovery, hanging out with certain people, pressures that you're having either in your relationship or at work. There are a number of stressors that are going on, the sharks as we call them, at least in my group, and helping people to hold on to their values and use recovery skills to stay the course and not run the risk of slips, lapses, and relapses is really important in this too.
Yeah. And I'll be a little really broad by saying this, but we see more so with our opiate patients than we do with, say, alcohol folks, is that their use has started at an earlier age and has had a more derailing effect on their development. And we know from the research that people will be using opioids for 8-9 years before they finally, on average, present themselves for treatment.
Is that right?
Yeah, so it's been going on for a very, very long time, causing a lot of devastation. And if you started earlier on, the coping mechanisms you have stopped developing. So if you can imagine starting this in your, say, mid-teens, and then you're using opioids for 9 years from there, you're into your into your 20s, but you still have sort of the coping capacity of that teenager, because you've not developed your relationships, not dealt with stressors, not been employed, and you've not progressed them like you typically would then from your teens to your 20s or even 30s. As we find that people then, and also criminal sorts of activities are inherent in this. You're lying and cheating and stealing in order to maintain the habit of the opioids, because like we said earlier, you're so intensely uncomfortable that you're desperate to make sure you continue to have your supply of opioids so that you can function. So you take these sort of dishonest, unsocial sort of behaviors, which we all engage in these ourselves. I've lied to protect myself from sort of shame or consequences.
Oh, sure.
So it's not.
I've sped on the street, broken the speed limit many times, but
exactly. So when I'm lied to, I don't take it so personally, but it then makes me say, okay, why am I being lied to? What is this person trying to protect themselves from? So I can start to develop some kind of a relationship. But all these modalities that Tom was talking about, these are really important that we start sort of retrain or give people the skills then to lead a functional life. Because we all want a good life, each and every one of us, and that is the point of what we're doing, is to help people reach a healthy, happy life.
Yeah.
So Dr. Kloster is talking about a really important component in this, and that is the relationship that he or I or a treater would develop with the client. If they feel that you are interested, if they feel that you have respect for them, if you are not getting angry when they lie, it's part of the disease that they have. It's the defenses that they use to cope. If you're thrown by that, it interferes with developing a really helping relationship. And understanding that is one thing. Being able to talk to other people in the field. I'm sure Dr. Kloster talks with the people that he works with, the clinicians that he works with, to make sure that we're not getting too stressed out in dealing with this, so that we can relate effectively with these folks, that they're not feeling judged, so that they're willing to participate in this. there's a context that they develop their addiction in, and understanding what that is really, really key. And when they feel that they're being understood and respected, they're more willing, also, in addition to the other things I was saying about the stages of change, they're willing to, give it a try to see if they can stay with this. So it's really critical. The medication is critical, training's critical, but the relationship that you have with them is really important too. Yeah.
And maybe it's like putting in a plug for organizations like Turning Point, who we have here on Main Street. They're part of the Vermont Recovery Network, which is a network of Turning Point facilities throughout the state. And Vermont is really, again, in this regard, with the addiction treatment trendsetter nationally in this regard. And simply the philosophy around this is that treatment probably takes place for how many hours a week? And then you have all these other facets around here. And think about your social needs, and be able to have a safe location to gather and to work with other people in recovery, and to have, say, recovery coaches who are there to offer guidance as well. A place to have, the AA and NA meetings. I know here they have groups for women with self-esteem, for example, the recovery walk annually, picnics, activities along those lines. And so it's really important that we're talking about changing your entire life.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I tell my patients that, in a way, you've arrived in a new country, right? And you need to learn the language, the customs, and the ways of carrying on. And that's kind of tough, but that's rather what we're doing here is introducing you to a new way of life.
And Turning Point is available many more hours of the week, as the doctor was saying, than a treatment session, or even we offer intensive outpatient services, which is 3 hours a day, 3 times a week, or 4, depending on this. There's still a lot of other hours in the day and the week. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to be? Who are you going to spend your time with? And there at Turning Point, there are other people supportive of your recovery. There are all of these other activities that the doctor was referring to. They've had meditation groups there. They've had other things that they've offered in this. So to enhance the possibility and your odds of staying in recovery. So it's a really important resource that we have.
Yeah, my wife has Parkinson's, and I've seen different groups where they have a group of people with Parkinson's that get together and they sing, or they have some kind of physical activity, or they do things that they wouldn't probably do on their own. It's just
and there's a feeling too that you want to be with people who understand your struggle. Right? And that of course is part of this as well. It's one of the research points of AA, for example, as to why it works, is because you're becoming part of a community that encourages you not to drink. So being with people of a like mind is really, really important. And I mean, sometimes even so, people are interested in what our drug use credentials are, because they feel like you can't understand someone who struggles with addiction unless you struggle with addiction yourself. For what that's worth and what it's not worth, I think it just speaks to how strongly the stigma, the impact that they've experienced to that point weighs on them. And there's just a very, very strong need to be understood and appreciated and respected.
I sometimes ask clients, how much time are you spending with people who are in the life, meaning using, or are working on recovery? And if they're spending hours and hours with people in the life as opposed to 1 hour with me, it makes me as good as I think I know what I'm doing.
Nobody's that good.
It's exactly the deal, that there's just too many other influences and too much else time in this. And worse, for some, they become isolated. Not only are they just hanging out with other people who use, birds of a feather fly together, flock together. But sometimes they get isolated. They're not talking about any of these things. They're in their own little silos. And to be able to go to groups and AA or NA, it can be really useful for them to break out of that. And again, to be around people who are encouraging them to, leave it alone and find another way.
You must have had ideas about how these people, get rejected by different segments of society. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that. How, what kind of things these people who are attempting recovery bump into in society, which make them move backwards.
Well, I mean, stigma has been a big piece of this, of course.
Yeah.
And there's a recent movie called Anonymous People. So I'm making a couple of film recommendations here today, huh? And with this looked at this idea we have had that people who struggle with drugs should keep it quiet, right? Alcoholics Anonymous, what goes in the room stays in the rooms, for example. But then we see continuing the stigma, keeping the stigma alive. And what they're talking about here is that if you look back at the AIDS illness, for example, when that first developed, they were anything but quiet about that, right? Loud and proud, I think, was one of the expressions there. But also, they were more socially connected. They could have more influence on legislation and research budgets as well. So they made a lot of noise, and they put a lot of pressure on politicians. And we saw a lot of research going on for AIDS, and we have all the medications now. And whereas it used to be a death sentence within 10 years, now we're seeing people living decades. And so the idea is, why aren't we acting like that with addiction? Right? There are people who are in recovery who are doing quite well. There's famous actors, business people, state representatives who were in this movie talking about their life course with getting in trouble with drugs and then recovering and becoming productive. What we need more of that, because right now people look down upon people with drug issues. They don't want to rent to them. They don't want to employ them. They likely have some kind of criminal record, charges that get in the way of them then progressing their life. So those are some of the real areas where people have struggles when they're getting into recovery.
So that said, I know, having spoken to a number of people who are in human resources, looking to hire people. There's only so many people that you can hire in a small community, and they know that addiction happens. You're not permitted to ask about addiction kinds of issues, but when there's gaps in their work history and other kinds of things, sometimes they wonder about it. And when a potential personnel candidate discloses that he's had addiction issues but is in recovery, the human resources people that I've spoken to says, we love people in recovery. We love people who are going to meetings, who are addressing this. They show up to work. They're desperate to get back into the fold and be able to work in this. They often make very good employees when they're in recovery on this, and they are continuing to work this through. Talking about stigma, it starts really early. Many of my clients started out either they were in families where addiction was a huge issue, or abuse of other kinds were there, or they had issues in school like attention deficit disorder and or other kinds of things. And these things are known to be related to developing substance abuse problems going on. But you can imagine a youngster with ADHD getting shunned by other people his age because there are a lot of work to be around in this. And so, they're not hanging around with, the most appropriate and productive kids. They end up hanging around with other kids that have had troubles, who lead them into using other kinds of things. They develop reputation. I can tell you that many of my clients, worry, whether in the community or with their own families, am I going to be able to break this bad rep, this role that I've had of being the black sheep of the family, or whatever else in this. But with treatment being talked about in many more places, including Cat TV, thank you, it's starting to break some of the stigma. It isn't broken yet, believe me. People still deal with shame and guilt all the time in this. But, these kinds of movies that the doctor's talking about, other people breaking their own anonymity, being able to disclose that, hey, it happened to me and I'm working through this, here are some of the positive things that you can, get if you stay with it and work this through. So those are important parts of this too.
Yeah, I mean, those risks too. I mean, you sort of hinted the idea of nature versus nurture. And what we talk about now instead of that is genes and environment, right? I mean, nature is sort of the genes you're born with, right? We get sort of a mixing from both of our parents. And then environment can be anything else that happens from the day you're born.
Yeah.
And the thinking is that roughly 50-50 mixture of genes and environment lead to drug issues. So I mean, it might know somebody, for example, who looks at their father was an alcoholic, grandfather was an alcoholic, great-grandfather, uncles are alcoholics. Hey, you know what? I'm not going to drink, right? Because I've got this terrible history here.
Yeah.
Or they grew up with alcoholism and all those negative experiences that I'm not going to drink. So now we're kind of looking at genetic and environmental experiences then that lead a person not to drink, or might lead somebody to drink. Early introduction to alcohol, for example, we know the earlier you start to use, the greater your risk of developing alcoholism. So, if you're a 10-year-old child, beer's always in the fridge, nobody's watching you, you take a sip, you're like, I really like this, I'm gonna keep on sneaking these beers. Then you've got both genes and environment that are contributing to you developing alcoholism almost assuredly. And one of the things we started to notice about are called social determinants of health. And this is the idea, part of this is what's called adverse childhood experiences. I think the research started out of Yale around that. And we recognize they might not be, trauma would be considered an adverse childhood experience. But also it could be other things, for example, poor nutrition, growing up in poverty, doing poorly in school, for example. And an accumulation of those sorts of experiences then also has a very strong role in leading towards troubles with drugs also.
So these are the things that we look for in an initial assessment that we might have with somebody who comes in and is referred to us. We do a very thorough psychosocial history to begin to understand them and also to develop some rapport with them, but to figure out, how did this develop? How did this work? And those components are very important in this. And then more specific to the substance use, there is another component to the assessment. We do something at United Counseling Services, I'm sure the doctor does it as well, something called an ASAM evaluation, American Society of Addiction Medicine, which looks at certain dimensions, whether they're dealing with withdrawal, continued withdrawal, or emotional issues. Are there health issues going on? Are they ready to change in this? What's the environment that they're in right now? What previous treatments did they have, and was it effective or not? I was saying before about doing values-based treatment. You can get referred for treatment. Somebody can hold a gun to your head and say, go. And while you're there and the gun is still to your head, you often mind your manners. But how committed you are to it, I don't know. But if you're using your own, if we can connect you to your own values, your own inner reasons for wanting to stay in recovery, and give you the skills to be able to do it when the sharks, as I said before, are surrounding you, then there's a chance that after treatment, formal treatment is done, that they'll hold on to this much longer. But yeah.
Yeah, I wonder about the negative influence on, say, people in middle school or high school when they're bullied by somebody, and I think there may be some knee-jerk reaction of people saying, well, if they're being bullied, there's probably something wrong with them. And if we could change the attitude and say, well, if the person's being bullied says to himself, well, if they're bullying me, they must see something important about me.
Well, that's an interesting cognitive switch, and being able to get people to that is, and kids especially to that, is a challenge. But yes, early adverse incidents in childhood, and it's often not just one; it's a pattern of things, as the doctor was describing. You start to develop something that I call a life script, a way of thinking about yourself in this world. And some life scripts are all but guaranteed to bring more trouble in there, and to begin to help people to revise that script, revise the narrative of their life is really important, and that's where treatment comes in, and being involved with other people who are, less judgmental and more likely to encourage you to do healthy things and smarter things.
Yeah, and absolutely, I mean, bullying is a great risk factor for a whole host of mental health issues. And again, I mean, sometimes we falsely separate out addiction from mental health as if they're two separate things. We really should, when we talk about mental health, we should be talking about addiction, depression, anxiety, everything sort of belongs under that umbrella. But in the case of children who are bullied, for example, now with the availability on the internet to just really magnify that. Of course, depression, anxiety, we're seeing suicides in children who are bullied as well. So it really is a very important area. And teaching children who are bullied how to respond, right? How to change that life script is really important, because we recognize that developing resilience in childhood is a great protective factor, right? So the more children can learn to navigate socially, to deal with these sorts of conflicts, the better protected they'll be then from a host of mental illnesses.
For them to find out that there's help available, to know where it is, as the doctor was saying, the internet, they all have devices. It's amazing how facile they are with all of these devices, but it brings bullying and intimidation right into the house, into the bedroom. There's hardly any protected place in this. But for them, for these children and teens to know that there are places where they can get support and help, that they can ask for help and not be looked down on, and get some support, so that they're not dealing with this on their own, and being so alone and at risk for depression, and the worst of depression, suicide, which is also unfortunately been on the rise in this. And I know that the schools have school counselors. I've supervised a couple of them for licensure in substance abuse treatment, because it's gravitated down to younger and younger years. The chemicals, alcohol, marijuana, those are the first two usually. Cigarettes, I guess, nicotine. They find these, first, that change the way you feel for a little while. You feel better or different, and of course, they, once they start to chase that high, that difference, that's when all sorts of things start to occur.
So I wonder if there could be some kind of an interventionist system where somehow we could find out, okay, this person just got a bullying message on their internet, and the third party it's come to our attention that you have recently been bullied. Now this is how you might want to think about being bullied, and this is what you can do about it.
Absolutely. I think something we've been touching on here is the idea of different levels of prevention. In medicine, we talk about sort of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Now, as we've talked about things like Suboxone treatment, getting into residential intensive outpatient programs once you develop addiction, that's considered tertiary prevention. So that's late in the stage there. And what that refers to, well then, at least from a medical perspective, we want to decrease morbidity and mortality from the illness. And I mean, in plain English, that means we want to decrease the badness in your life. We want to stop you from dying early. And that's the approach of these tertiary preventions, which I think I have to say is what our medication-assisted therapies are. If you think about then when we get vaccines as children, we're getting exposed to a weaker form of the virus, so we develop antibodies against the illness, and that's why we don't have smallpox anymore, right? So we've managed to do a primary prevention there. We've done something then that allows us to never get that illness. And then secondary prevention is sort of like the idea of screening. So, for example, screening for testicular cancer in late teens, for breast cancer to the older years. Then these are examples of trying to detect the problem early and then to minimize the impact of it. And so when you talk about getting to schools and developing resilience, in the case where you mentioned where, okay, you've been bullied, to come to our attention, please, come here. That is an approach that's very important overall, but in the schools as well. I had an interview once with Ron Staley, who was the superintendent for one of the supervisory unions over in the Brattleboro area. Their mental health approach in school was very much sort of tiered along those lines, that there were sort of population-based approaches they were using to try to address mental health issues. And then as more experiences or more events came to their attention, then they would go toward a stronger level of intervention with those students. So, you know, and again, the schools get sort of tasked or asked to do so many things, but it really is, that is a critical place, even starting with elementary school, if you want to think about doing some primary prevention, some resiliency development, and in order then to have children not go down the path that they will go down with numerous adverse childhood experiences.
So at United Counseling Services, we have a specialized children's unit that helps with early identification, and then they use a particular model to help children develop this resilience, these abilities to cope and manage. Often the families are included in this too, and it has been pretty successful. I'd love to see a longitudinal study to kind of see if how these kids do who get this early identification and intervention, if they might be able to avoid some of the other things that have happened versus other people who were identified but they didn't get the benefit of some of these treatments that are out there.
And something's working, at least say in the field of, in the area of alcohol. Recent national survey had shown that children are drinking less than they did in our days.
Oh, wow.
And unfortunately, across the entire population, the amount of alcohol consumption has stayed the same because baby boomers are drinking more now than previous people in that age group had done. But something's happening there because our kids in the teens and 20s are not drinking like kids in their teens and their 20s did decades ago. So there is hope then with the right messaging and with the right sort of social attitudes then that we can prevent these issues coming down the road.
So you personally are then allowed to give this, whatever this medication was, to 275 people,
right?
The limit. So does that give you some concept over the years of the intensity of the problem here in Bennington? I mean, do you see that your caseload is increasing or tops out or whatever?
So I think I first came to Bennington about 5.5, I'm up here approaching 6 years now. And in the course of that time, so of course I have the 200 patients in Bennington I'm working with right now. And the state and other sort of treatment organizations have been trying to get a idea of how large the problem is in Bennington. Right? And it's very hard to get rigorous numbers and that sort of thing, but at least I can say personally that I'm working with 200 people right now, and there's probably another 200 people who I have worked with that I'm no longer working with. And there can be a number of reasons for that. I mean, sometimes people fall away from treatment and you can't chase them hard enough to bring them back. Sometimes it becomes clear that their needs for treatment exceed what I can do in my setting, in which case then we want to refer them to a higher, more intense level of treatment, either temporarily or for long term. So that would put me like about 400 people that I personally had contact with in the Bennington area who struggle with opioids, just specifically opioids, ignoring alcohol, marijuana, and cocaine. And people try to estimate, but sometimes the estimates are maybe 1 in 5 people who need treatment actually come for treatment. So then if you want to multiply that, then it gives you an idea that the Bennington County might have enough people to support more treatment providers.
And so that's just Nels, and he specializes in this. At United Counseling Services, we treat a lot of different conditions, but the IMAT program is at maximum capacity at the moment, and that's 65. They're hoping to increase that. But we're also stationed in, as I've said before, in various medical practices. There's something called a hub and spoke model in the state of Vermont. Hubs have been in Rutland and Brattleboro and other places, The IMAT program is sort of like a mini hub kind of thing. But 65 in IMAT, another 65 at Mount Anthony Primary Care, 20 approximately at Shaftesbury Medical. I don't even know what the numbers are out in Wilmington. Pretty big.
Think about another about you could easily get 150, 200 more patients who are being adequately managed with their primary care physicians for their opiate dependency.
Oh, really?
In this. So on top of what Nels is seeing, there are all of those, and then all of those people who are not coming for treatment. 1 in 5 coming.
Yeah.
That means 4 in 5 aren't, at least at the moment in this. So, and and again, there's more addiction out there than opiate addiction in this, with alcohol still being very problematic. And
well, we're going to have a lot of new business now with the liberalization of marijuana laws. Right?
Yeah.
We know that with legality of any substance, we see an increase in use.
At a younger age.
At a younger age, with commercialization, we see an increased push then to consume more, and this is quite clearly going to cause issues.
And there is something called tolerance. I mentioned that before. In order to get the effects that you originally found on something, often you need to increase the dosage, the amount. People that with alcohol that started out and get the effects on 2 or 3 beers are now up to a 6-pack, a 12-pack, a 24-pack. I have people in treatment that are drinking a 30-pack of beer a day and other amounts of alcohol every day. So there's never a period of time where there isn't alcohol in the bloodstream on this. But this whole marijuana thing, this is an interesting experiment. I'm hoping that it works out, but what I know about addiction is that, a number of people who wouldn't have tried it because it wasn't legal are now going to try it because it is legal. Some of them will get caught. Tolerance will build. They'll need, more and more of this to manage. They won't be learning other coping skills, work skills, other kinds of things. And oh, by the way, it costs serious money. Insurance isn't going to pick up the tab for this, I can guarantee. Not for the substance itself, but these modern forms of marijuana where the THC content is 40-50% higher, something called dabs that the kids use. It costs a lot of money. I have a client right now. He's spending, $600 every 2 or 3 weeks on this. Where does that money come from?
And the estimates are that 20% of your consumers are going to consume 80% of the substance, in this case marijuana. And that's most likely going to be the people who are already struggling. So kids are not doing well in school. Adults are not able to maintain employment, are having issues maintaining housing. These are the people who are most effective and more seriously impacted by more of any substance being available there. And that's going to have great social costs as well. So despite the idea that there'd be these great revenues by farming and selling and producing, like we talked about earlier, and with the idea of sort of treatment's expensive, but no treatment is more expensive, there will be revenues coming in from marijuana, but these revenues are going to go out by all the needs for mental health addiction treatment. That's going to come out. Accidents, looking at Colorado and Washington, a lot of the federal agencies are been pulling together data out there. If anybody's interested, that's kind of a funny name, but the Rocky Mountain High Traffic Drug Area studies. And they look at emergency department visits, child ingestions, the changing rates of motor vehicle accidents, and there will be costs to this, and they will, if it's anything like tobacco and alcohol, they will be greater than any kind of revenues brought into a state.
The treatment facility that I spoke to out in Colorado said that the promise of all of this money coming in for treatment has not exactly borne out because states have this money coming in for taxation on marijuana, but they have a lot of people asking for money. We have legislative breakfasts every year at UCS, and when we're promoting what we need to provide mental health and substance abuse treatment for all the reasons that we've already talked about, Senator Sears, who's been a real advocate for us, we're lucky to have him in many ways on this. He says, well, who do I tell doesn't get their money? What programs don't get funding for? And so it's very complicated in this. So we'll see how this plays out over time. Hoping it all works out.
I mean, like we were saying earlier, I mean, one side of this argument is going to be saying, I told you so when the dust settles. I really do hope that it's not us saying, I told you so. But I'm putting my money on our position.
Even more than that, there are times now where I see things touted, marijuana is touted for treating PTSD. I've never seen any research that says that works. I see research for exposure therapy and other things, and there's research that says that works. I heard from this person in Colorado that because marijuana does have some effect on nausea when people are getting chemo for cancer, that now they're promoting it for pregnant women who have nausea. I think that this is a mistake. Pregnant women, it crosses the placenta barriers, and I'm wondering how this is going to play out. Again, longitudinal studies will tell us.
Drug baby.
I mean, unfortunately, if you look at the medical data and research, there's very little support for marijuana to be medical. Should there be research? Absolutely. For example, cannabidiols, which are one of the two main constituents in marijuana, they do appear to have some potential for treating epilepsy. And there's a pharmaceutical company in Great Britain that is developing a medication based on a strain that was called Charlotte's Web around treating epilepsy. But these other areas, maybe something with chemo, nausea, and loss of appetite. But the rest of these claims are pretty much coming from the Marijuana Policy Project, groups that are very financially and intensely interested in expanding the commercial use of marijuana. And even a number of us think that the whole concept of medical marijuana was really a creation of the marijuana liberalization lobby. This did not come from medicine, because you don't smoke medication, you don't take a medication that's intoxicating, and you don't take a medication unless you know the exact amount of milligrams or nanograms that you're giving yourself. So this has just could have been political and popular pressure to expand the list of what are called indications for medical marijuana. And one of the latest ones, which causes grave concern, is the idea that, for example, PTSD should be a condition that allows the green card, that allows someone to have medical marijuana, because it's not based in science. It's based on stories by isolated people who think it sounds like a great idea.
So those things are of concern for sure. I was hoping that I know our time is starting to run a little low, that there are services available for people. Yes, it's at the tertiary end of the problems, but there is treatment. At United Counseling Services, we offer multiple groups, including intensive outpatient 3 times or 4 times a week. There are other groups offered once a week. Based on the model that I was telling you about. There's individual counseling in a joint collaboration with the hospital. We have intensive medically assisted treatment up at 339 Dewey Street. The Suboxone that the doctor and I have spoken about. There is treatment available there. I know that Nels can speak to what he has available, but you can find us in the telephone directory or on your website. Maybe we can leave the phone numbers that are available for people to access this treatment.
And I've been actually involved with developing a hub in Bennington, which is that people where sort of what allows the greater expansion of treatment. They have these types of facilities in Brattleboro and Westridge. So hopefully within a year to have an operation like that, which would probably more than double the capacity that I have right now. I think for a lot of people too, if they would approach their primary care physicians, the state has something called the Blueprint for Health that puts counselors and nurses in all the primary care offices here in Bennington. And that could also be sort of, again, an entry point to finding out what the resources might be.
Yeah. Great. Fantastic. Well, thank you, Tom and Nels. And I'm sure we've informed a few more people in the public about the resources that are available for this problem.
Well, thank you for having us here.
Yeah,
I
Nathan, it was
appreciate
a
it.
pleasure. Thank you.
Right.
Mhm.
Thank you.